This is not Prerna's first time here at the Azim Premji University. She was here with us when we had organized a roundtable on mental health, and with a very short turnaround time, she had actually managed to come here. And what she said during the mental health roundtable is something that, after that, we had always thought about calling her, and between her schedule and our schedule, it had not matched until now. And I'm really happy that she's accepted. Now she's done a bit of jugglery to actually come here. So she's done that jugglery and she's here. So I'm just going to do a very short introduction, but I think while she's talking about her work, she'll also talk a little bit about herself, which I think works the best rather than me saying something that's written out. So Prerna is someone who's worked in multiple contexts outside of the strict boundaries of psychology, psychiatry, and institutionalized mental health. So she's used different kinds of pedagogies. She trains people using different kinds of pedagogies, from role plays to theater to different kinds of ways of bringing together ways of understanding. And she wears multiple hats. So one of the organizations that she's involved with is the Kashmir Lifeline. And she'll talk about, a lot of her talk today is going to be about the experience of working with the Kashmir Lifeline and the everydayness of the conflict and violence in Kashmir and people's experience of it. She's also a psychotherapist based in Delhi, and she does a lot of work on grief and existential therapy. And I think that's something that, at least the students in the mental health course, we've talked a little bit about grief and understanding grief in some form. I'm not going to take too much time. She's worked in multiple contexts. She's taught in a university in Japan. She's worked in Japan. She's worked in California. She's worked in Kashmir and in other parts of India. She's worked in an organization called Aangan in Mumbai with children. So there's an entire range of experience that she brings with her today. And while the topic is about Kashmir, but I think it'll be informed by all that she's done over the years with mental health. So thank you, Prerna, for coming, and hand over to her.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Benson, for calling me back. And thank you, APU, for making time. Oh, I guess not. It is on. Yes? Okay. Is this better? It kind of sounds the same. I'll put it higher. Is this better? Is it? Is it working? Sounds the same. Okay, all right, excellent. Okay, so I have a little slideshow, but this is just photographs, and this is essentially more a reminder for me to move on from one topic to the next. So we're going to talk about Kashmir as the main topic, but it kind of resonates to young people everywhere, because a lot of things that happen in Kashmir actually, in some context or the other, happen in other parts of the world as well, the alienation that people feel, especially when they're younger. So let's start. We're going to start by talking about Kashmir Lifeline. I'm sorry about the slides. There's some... Okay. How do I go on to the next one? Okay. All right, great. So this is our main clinic in Srinagar. It's called Kashmir Lifeline and Health Center. We are part of this British organization called Healing Kashmir. Which was, yeah? Okay, all right, we're back. Which was started by my friend Justine Hardy. She's an author. She's written on Kashmir. She's also a psychotherapist. And the organization was started in 2011, and I joined in 2012. My role was initially to train the team in various forms of psychotherapy, but and it was supposed to be over a couple of semesters, but now it's been 6 years and I'm still there. So also because there's, there are many things outside of just training that need to happen in a place like Kashmir, and this you figure out as you live there. You know, there is, if we go on to, okay, I guess it's not moving, that's fine. I am pressing it. Okay. All right. Okay, just go on the slide. Okay. So how Kashmir Lifeline works is that there's a 3-tier system. We start with a helpline, which is, that's the number up there. And it's a 1-800 number, which means it's free to call. And you can call from anywhere, all throughout the country. The good thing is that, which is something that we tell a lot of our clients, is that you can have zero balance on your cell phone to call. You know, so that is something that happens a lot in Kashmir, where for various reasons they don't work. Now the helpline is also mobile, which means that in times when there's curfew or hartal, we have special phones which the team carries with them. So when we can't make it to the main clinic, okay? We also do one-on-one counseling and psychotherapy. I don't have a photograph of that because that is confidential and no one really wants to have that seen. Along with that, we do a lot of holistic kind of physical therapy. Reiki is part of it. So Reiki has been shown to be very, very effective with the physical somatization of stress. You know, so we have people who come from outside to train the team, and then our team members become Reiki practitioners, and we have 2 rooms where clients can get Reiki. There is an outreach program as well, and we reach out to schools and colleges, but largely we work with the Aangan women, and once a month we do awareness programs in different districts where we not only talk about the nature of the distress that happens in places like Kashmir, but we also, you know, the Aangan women kind of become like barefoot counselors. You know, they kind of take on the role of identifying and helping people and also referring them on to us. We are now trying this on with rural schools where the Aangan women go to schools and, you know, they will either do some work with them or they will refer them to us if there are problems. Okay. So if we look at the outreach programs, there are 2 in Srinagar. The main clinic is, like I said, in Bagat, which is a residential area, but we also have rooms in different hospitals in Srinagar. So in SMHS hospital, which is the main hospital there, we have a room where we see patients who've been referred by doctors to us. In various hospitals all through Kashmir, we have that. So Aangan, which is in the mountains, and Baramulla up north. And more recently in the south, which is where a lot of the problems since last year have been. So Chare Sharif downwards, the Chare Sharif, Shopian, and Anantnag. Since 2016, that has actually been the flashpoint of you know, all the trouble that's happened over the last year and a half. So there are ebbs and flows. Essentially what happens is that 2 of our team members who live in these areas will, instead of coming to the main center in Srinagar, will go to these outreach centers and they will do individual or group work with people who come there. So this allows them to see clients face to face because most of them can't travel to Srinagar. It's, you know, given the situation currently, and generally it's just harder. So this is one of the things that we do. Now, next we're going, let me talk a little bit about the team. Let me go back. Okay, so this is essentially the KLL team. There's Justine, a fearless leader in front, and most of, in fact, all of the team members, other than Justine and me and Manzoor, who is our admin guy, they're between the ages of 18 to 30. So they are, some of them have been there from the beginning, and some of them have joined recently, because we do lose every year a couple of team members to government jobs. Government jobs are the holy grail of jobs in Kashmir, especially because there aren't that many permanent job positions. So even though they end up doing things that they're not really trained for, then actually something they don't really like, they do leave and take those jobs. So that is something that happens. But it's also interesting because they all live in these areas. They're coming, this is their life as well. So when they're working with their clients, there is a much greater empathy, because they are from the same communities, they're going through the same struggles. The day they can't make it to the clinic, that things are bad everywhere. But it's also slightly problematic because they're doing all of this work, and it's very difficult for them to decompress after this. So not only do they're living in this situation where things are bad, but they're also listening to people talk about the problems. So what we've started is we have peer group of group therapy, where once a week, if I'm in Kashmir, I will join in person, otherwise I join in on Skype. They will do peer therapy, where they work and talk about their issues, and that is something that really, really helps. Overall, we have found that group therapy is of great use in a place like Kashmir, because most people are going through the same thing. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to talk about so everyday life in Kashmir. I realized when I was getting these photographs that these were from my initial trips to Kashmir, because initially it was all really, really jarring. Walking down the street and there is razor wire everywhere. There is CRP stuff everywhere. There's a military presence all the time. Now I've been going there for 6 years, and frankly, it's something that I don't kind of pay any attention to. So that is something to remember. But what is also equally important is that every time I come back, I go once a month for a week. I go up to Srinagar, and every time I come back, I do feel jittery. It takes me a day or two to start to feel normal again. So that is me being able to come back. So let us imagine a whole population that lives with this every day. We all talk about how it's the most highly militarized zone in the world. More than that, it's the fact that it is, at any point, it can change. So on any given day, you don't know whether it's going to be a good day or bad. And it's that uncertainty which actually causes the most psychological distress. If you're prepared for any kind of situation, you take the appropriate steps. You're like, we're not going to go here, not going to go there. Usually you find out in the morning, or even when you're on your commute, that something has happened, that either there's been a protest or a strike, or in 2016 there were IID bombs that were being found, and so on. So that is the uncertainty of it in their everyday life is something that is relevant here. Okay? When we talk about the symptoms that we usually see, so most of our clients are, 70% of our clients are between the ages of 18 to 30. And that is because we have aimed towards these groups with our outreach programs in colleges and schools. We also do a radio program on Radio Kashmir, where we do role plays in Kashmiri about what are common problems that people might face. And we have a sticker program where, after asking permission, we put stickers of our work on buses and so on. And we also have a Facebook presence, which I think a lot of young people use to get access to us. But as they've started to come in, we've noticed that there is a combination of symptoms. There is what we call a constellation of symptoms, which is very, very common in young people. So what happens is, usually there is overarching symptoms of depression. So they will be sadness, There will be, which they will, they'll be crying. There will be what we call anhedonia, which is a loss of interest in previously pleasurable activity. There is sleeplessness, insomnia or hypersomnia, where they sleep a lot. But along with this, there is a mix of symptoms of anxiety as well. The anxiety comes and goes. The anxiety is, but the underlying depression seems to be there for a long time. Symptoms of anxiety, they will often say becheni, which is restlessness, or they will say dimagi pareshani, which is, anxiety, which is how they describe anxiety. There are also physical symptoms of anxiety that they will express, which is, sweating or heart beating fast or sometimes nausea, symptoms of panic, These are more easily identified by people because they're physical. Any physical symptom, you can say, okay, this is what's going on. But usually what we find is that this comes and goes. The depression seems to be continuous. Of the various psychological disorders, there are a couple that have really, really shot up in frequency amongst young people. And the one that we find very, very commonly is obsessive-compulsive disorder. Everyone knows OCD? Right. So it's basically, it starts with having repetitive, unwanted, almost intrusive thoughts, and which cause anxiety. And because the mind does not want to deal with anxiety, it tries to neutralize this with either behavior or mental acts. What happens is that it doesn't work because it just, the avoidance of the anxiety just strengthens it. But there is a certain pattern of OCD that we have found to be very, very common, especially in young people, both men and women. And essentially what happens is that, first of all, they are what we assume are very natural thoughts about sex. These are teenagers, they're thinking about sex, the idea of having sex, there's masturbation. All of these things have come into their landscape. But all of this, given the culture of Kashmir, I'm sure it's true in many other parts of the country as well, but Kashmir being, a majority Muslim state, there is also this idea that this is not okay religiously. This is what they often use the word napak, which is that it is unclean, perhaps, in some way. And what that does is that, if they confess to friends or even to family members, they will tell them, stop doing it. What you're doing is wrong. So what that does, what you're doing is wrong, it goes against the tenets of Islam. So what that does is that very often that leads to another obsessive thought, which is about blasphemy. So very often the thoughts about sex almost get converted to thoughts about the Prophet Muhammad, or even the practice of Islam, and so on. Many young male clients talk about how when they're doing their prayers, they start to have sexual thoughts. And so now they're feeling doubly unclean, because not only are they thinking about something that is taboo, they're doing it in a place where they should definitely not be thinking this, And right away what happens is that all of this anxiety is translated into a much simpler way to deal with it, which is unclean. So what they start to do is, the compulsion that happens is washing behavior. So what they start to do is they think that I'm thinking about sex, I'm thinking against Islam, I'm dirty. And so what they start to do is, we have seen many, many clients who have compulsive washing behavior, and who are in the bathroom for hours, because it's a big jumble there, right? The thought happens, the thought is connected to the thought about blasphemy, that is connected to being unclean, unworthy, and okay, I can do something about feeling unclean, which is this repetitive thought. So by the time they come to us, women usually come to us around the time they're getting married, where often either they have been sent to us or they feel that they should sort this out before they get married. Men come to us very, very often, and we've actually had groups of boys come to us where they're like, it's like, this is what's going on with a bunch of us. So it's not even, and therefore, we do a lot of group work with them, and it is something that works. But that is what kind of got our attention, that people were talking about this almost as if this was their reaction to feeling out of control, you know. Another very common thing is somatization, which is when your psychological distress is expressed in body or physical symptoms. And again, there is some gender difference. Men usually complain about pain in the back or the knees or the neck. Women usually complain about pain in the stomach or reproductive issues. They will go to the doctor will say nothing's wrong with you, you know, you're absolutely fine, it's in your head. They will usually be given medication, and then they will come to us. Okay. So now we come to the self-medication part. That is another big problem that's happening in Kashmir. You know, all of the people who have any kind of complaint, they will go first to see a doctor. And whether it's a psychiatrist or a GP, they will, you know, give them medication right away. So there is almost an epidemic of, you know, anti-anxiety medication being prescribed to people. I mean, we see people who are on really, you know, more than a combination of drugs which they shouldn't be on. And sometimes that explains things like the symptoms of depression. You know, it's almost like I ask them, how do you even, you know, get up in the morning given the amount of drugs that you're taking? But they're also getting these drugs from the chemists and from pharmacies. You know, you don't really need a prescription in many ways. There is a lot of hashish that is smoked. Alcohol is very, very rare because, again, it goes against the tenets of Islam, and also it's not available easily. So many, I have actually yet to see, you know, a young client come in who is not on some form of self-medication. And one of the things that we have to do first is to wean them off. And again, you know, it's not like stop right away and don't take it anymore. Even that process of weaning, some of them are impatient with, because they're like, you know, I can stop this anytime, and you can't. It's a physiological addiction, and it's difficult to kind of get over. Okay. So, right, and finally the last one, which is new and which is newer, I guess, is the idea of self-harm. And self-harm is what we see is cutting behavior, and we see trichotillomania. And cutting is usually, trichotillomania is when you have a compulsive need to pull out hair from either the top of your head, your eyebrows, even sometimes your pubic area. And cutting is essentially light cuts in different parts of the body, depending on whether you want other people to know. Sometimes people will cut along their thighs or their inner arms, or even on their stomach. Sometimes their hands, their wrists, and so on. It is different from having any suicidal ideation. You know, actually, suicidal thoughts may happen in Kashmir, but acts of suicide are actually not that common. And part of it is cultural. Part of it does come from the idea that in Islam, it is considered a sin. So even though we will have people talk about not wanting to live anymore, they will usually not talking about ending their life in that particular way. The cutting behavior or the self-harm is usually done for the opposite reason. It's usually when they're feeling numb, or they're feeling like they, you know, there's a loss of interest, and it's almost like people say it all the time, I cut so I can feel something, you know. Trichotillomania often becomes a compulsive action to avoid the anxiety, and for both of them, you know, this is newer, as is we get a few cases of eating disorders, where, and mostly with women, eating disorders, and mostly of the order of bulimia, which is eating and then throwing up to make sure that they don't put on weight. But if we look at all of these are all maladaptive ways to get an illusion of control. All the various, whether it's OCD, whether it's self-harm, any of these are ways in which the mind has decided I am in charge. Especially if I can control my body, I'm fine. I have no control over the environment because that keeps changing, but at least I can control my body. So it is essentially something that the mind kind of figures it should happen, but it is maladaptive because it causes a lot of psychological distress, and it causes them a lot of concern about what will happen if I can't stop this. That is the main thing they come in, they say like, "Theek ho jayega na? I'll get okay because I really need to get okay because I can't be living in Kashmir and also be going through all of this at the same time." Okay? All right. So when a specific critical event happens, so this is every day. We'll start by talking about the floods in 2014. This is a picture of one of the lakes, and essentially everything, there are little islands on both the lakes there, and everything was underwater. And this is about a month later. This is a photograph that I took, and it was still quite bad. But essentially when we talk about a specific critical event, whether it's a natural disaster or whether it is any other kind of crisis, the psychological response that we have is, especially when the event is happening or it's just over, is kind of pretty uniform, but that depends on two things. First of all, the crisis or the disaster has to be experienced or at least witnessed, So either you have to be present and it should be happening to you, or you have seen it happening, and the second, and it should involve either an actual death, a fear of death, or serious injury, fear of serious injury. The words that are often, the word that is often thrown around all the time now is PTSD, and now people have PTSD when they miss the bus. But essentially, PTSD is actually quite rare. Even in a place like Kashmir, PTSD is quite rare. We have something called acute stress disorder, which is more common. It has a similar cluster of symptoms, but as the word acute says, it's short term, and it is less intense. We've had a few cases of PTSD, but not in the way that people just bandy the word around with it, like, oh, all of Kashmir has PTSD. Clinically, it doesn't. Okay, so what are these symptoms? So for both acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, the first thing is re-experiencing the trauma. So what that means is that the person who has undergone that traumatic event will either have flashbacks of it, or they will have nightmares about it. Often these are seen as more distressful than the event itself, because when the crisis situation is happening, you are actually too busy surviving it. It's only in the aftermath, when the flashbacks and the re-experiencing happens, that it becomes something that is very, very distressful. The second is that simultaneously there is emotional numbness. It's also because there has been an overload of emotion at that point. There's also an avoidance of any reminders of that particular situation, whether it is the place, whether it is some smell. Smell is a big one. Or people, activities that have been around that. People tend to avoid that. And the third one is increased physical arousal. And this lasts for a while, where essentially they feel jumpy. They feel like they are constantly in a state of fight or flight, because for them sometimes it's almost like as the re-experiencing is happening, they feel they're back there again. So they will have difficulty concentrating, they'll have difficulty sleeping, they'll be easily irritated and angered. For acute stress disorder, these symptoms last for about a month, and especially if people get help, they resolve within a month, and in follow-ups they will say that those particular symptoms are not happening. In PTSD, PTSD is usually diagnosed when the symptoms have been around for 6 months or more. And if untreated, PTSD symptoms can last through the person's life. Another form of PTSD is what's called delayed onset, where there may not be an immediate reaction to the crisis as it's happening, but days, months, weeks, even years later, they might show exactly the cluster of symptomatology. Like I said, in the 6 years that I've worked here, I think I have seen maybe 4 classic PTSD cases, but I have seen a lot of ASD cases. Okay? All right. So the 2014 floods, essentially, so they were a much more defined kind of disaster. First of all, there was a name for it. It's a natural disaster, Secondly, it had a time period for which it was there. It peaked around, wait just a second, sorry. So it peaked around September 7th and September 8th, where the level of the water was really, really high. But by mid-September, the water had started going down. By the time we made it up there, this is about 3 weeks later. So if you can see in the picture, you can see the water was all the way that high, and there was a lot of damage, but the water levels had gone down considerably. So the first thing is, as any natural disaster happens, in whatever way the government does come in, whether it's the state government or the central government, relief was provided. It was, and Kashmiri people did feel that yes, it was somewhat delayed, but there was, relief that was being provided by the state government and by even the army. All of those are somewhat exaggerated when we see, oh, there were, these rescue missions. But of course, it did happen. The second thing is that it was, because it's a natural disaster, it is almost like every response can become state sanctioned. Most of the initial relief work, as the previous slide showed, was actually done by young people in Kashmir. All of them, Kashmir, most people, even though they live in a place which is surrounded by water, very few Kashmiris can actually swim, but young people who could swim, they went out there, they rescued people took shikaras out there, there were rafts which were made out of empty plastic bottles, and a lot of the initial rescue work was done by young people. Some of the relief work was also started by them, so a lot of the food drives and the medicine drives were done locally by people within communities. So they would literally, ask for all these supplies which were being sent from outside of Kashmir. They would go to the airport, pick stuff up, and then go out into these areas. So a lot of people who we talked to once we got there, there was a sense, yes, this is a crisis, but this is our crisis, and there was almost a sense of empowerment that look what we have done. We have saved lives. There were there were lives lost, but given the scale of the disaster, it wasn't that many, and that is largely due to communities mobilizing and kind of getting out there. Then another thing that happened here, which was relevant, was that a lot of referrals that came to us. We did a lot of outreach work. Then once the colleges reopened and so on. Okay, sorry. So this is, for example, this is at Women's College post-flood. We are talking about some of the things that they need to look out for, some ways in which they can take care of themselves and the communities and so on. So there was definitely people saying, come and help us. come and tell us what to do, which usually doesn't happen in Kashmir. Usually they usually don't really want that. We are at a hospital, we're at another college. So there was a lot of work that was happening around then. Essentially, at the end of this, we did a follow-up in December with not just our clients, but also at these colleges. Very few people reported symptoms of ASD anymore. They said that they felt that the crisis had been overcome, and they weren't feeling any of the flashbacks and so on. Some of the anxiety had come back because the rebuilding had to happen, and there was also about what's next. But essentially, a lot of people reported that we are going to be okay. Okay? We did another follow-up in March 2017, and not a single client reported any remnants of symptomatology from the floods, but again, the cluster was back. There was a lot of depression, there was a lot of anxiety, and there was a lot of anger because even though all of these things had been promised by the government in terms of aid, it hadn't come through. Okay? All right. Okay. So now let's talk about 2016. So 2016, first of all, I mean, it is definitely not a time-defined event because, frankly, in many ways, it's still ongoing. Even this year, there have been several incidents of violence. There have been the curfews continue, the strikes continue. It's not reported as much because I think somewhere, I think the mainstream media feels that people don't want to hear this anymore. But it is still ongoing, and it started with the death of Burhan Wani in July 2016. And from July to, I think, September, there was almost like full curfew all the time, So full curfew is essentially from 7 to 7, where you can't leave the house. There's usually shoot-at-sight orders. There is no private or public transportation that is allowed. They do I think once or twice a week, they will have dheel. They will allow people 2 hours to do grocery shopping in the neighborhoods, and then they go back. So for 3 solid months, it was a curfew situation where no one, including our team members, could actually go out or do anything. For the first month and a half, there was a clampdown on all forms of communication, including phones and the internet. Once the phones came on, we were able to get in touch with the team. I had literally left Kashmir 2 days before the killing, so then I was only able to return in September because things were really bad, and everyone said that there was no point in me going back up. So there was curfew, and once the curfew started lifting, then there were strikes that were being called by the Hurriyat to protest the curfew, to protest the killing, to protest all the pellet injuries. So it was almost like, if it's not a curfew, it's a strike. And sometimes strikes were worse because if there were many instances of local shops being burnt down because the protesters had seen a shutter open or something, and they would just burn the whole place down. Similarly, some schools had reopened. Those were also burnt down. Fortunately, there were no injuries. So there was a lot of violence, there was a lot of aggression, but there was almost this state of siege, that for months on end. And that is something that is, like I said, it comes and goes now. Now there are days where, Kashmiris thankfully also have a great morbid sense of humor about all of this, and they're like, they'll be like, oh, this is kind of a boring week, we haven't had anything happen. So, initially you're like, oh, but then you get that, you have to laugh at some of these things. So this is Ward 7 of SMHS. SMHS is the main hospital in Srinagar, and this is where all the pellet injury patients were sent, because this is the only one that has eye surgery. So if you look at the ward itself, it was teeming with people by the time we got there. We were asked by the doctors there to come in and work with the patients. And the turnaround time was very, very fast. So people would come in with the injuries, they would be patched up, and they would be sent because they needed room for more people. So on a daily basis, especially during the height of the protests, there were about 40 people coming in every day. And only the serious, and serious meant that you have to lose at least one eye in order to stay on. Otherwise, you were fixed and you were sent on your way. So what we were doing was that we were doing a lot of short-term crisis intervention work, but it was also kind of difficult. Because we hardly saw these people. We never saw the same faces. They were in and out. So it was like starting from scratch each time. Also, the people were also very wary of talking to us. There were lots of rumors, but also some truth that perhaps these conversations. There had been people who had come in from the government and had tried to round up people and so on. So. Frankly, not a lot of work got done. It was kind of very frustrating for the team, because they felt that, it was like going against the tide very much, that they would start some work and they would go back and that person had gone, or they said, I don't want to talk to you today. But what was useful was the parents started getting back in touch with us. And the parents were essentially, calling and saying that, this is what's going on in the family, this is how it is affecting us. And what we started to do was, we distributed this flyer. I'm sure all of you are fluent in Urdu. So, there you go. Okay. So, as you can see, it's a very general kind of description of signs and symptoms. We didn't want it to be specific. We didn't want to have, first of all, we also have to be very careful and diplomatic about what information we put out there. Also, we didn't want it to just be for the pellet injury patients. We wanted it to be for their family. We wanted these flyers to be taken home, shared amongst communities, because we also wanted to reach out to other people. Okay, so essentially, like I said, the main point was that we have a 1-800 number, and something that we reiterated all the time, which was actually good news, was that apparently 1-800 numbers cannot be tapped, or they cannot be traced. So if you call that, because that was, whether or not it was realistic, but this was a great fear, that if they call and talk about what's going on, the number will be traced, and because all phones are tapped. So 1-800 numbers are not. So that is also general information for you guys. Okay. We also had people call in who were not directly affected by, they weren't hurt during the protests and so on, but we got a lot of calls from people who were just feeling like their lives would never be the same, So from July to, I think, February that year, all academic institutions were shut. So July to December, they were shut because of the unrest. January and February because it's very cold. And it was very, very, so people hadn't gone to school or college for 6 months. And so we got a lot of people calling and talking about what's going to happen to me now? Are things ever going to get better? So, and there was also anger, there was anger towards the state and the system, but people also expressed anger towards the protesters, because they were like, we are doing this again and again, nothing changes, it's affecting our life in a certain way. And along with that, there was some guilt, because they're like, here I am concerned about my career, and there's someone who's lost an eye or someone who's lost their life. So all kinds of mixed emotions. We reopened our clinics, our various centers in late November, and we got a huge influx of people who came in. Some of them stayed. Most of them just came for a little while, but it was almost like, we need to talk about this, and we don't know to whom. Okay? All right. So that is essentially it, but I'm also going to now share 3 kind of case stories. Most of the cases that I'm going to talk about, obviously the names have been changed to respect their privacy, but also, a couple of them are combinations of 2 or more people, again to ensure greater discretion, but also because there are similarities there, okay? So the first person I'm going to talk about is Shazia. And Shazia is a 21-year-old female. She is from a progressive Kashmiri family, and she does not wear a headscarf, which is quite unusual now in Kashmir. She didn't wear a headscarf even when she was in Kashmir. In 2014, when the floods happened, she was studying at a private school in Srinagar, academically very bright, very active in school. In fact, she got in touch with KLL and helped organize an outreach program at the school because she felt a lot of kids had trouble dealing with it. That year, she had her class 12 board exams, and schools had been shut for 3 months. Their school particularly had been flooded, so they couldn't have any classes. But the school and the state government did arrange to have extra classes for these students, where these students could actually go and study in other schools. There were teachers actually called from outside to help teach, and she ended up taking her board exams, did well enough, enrolled in Delhi University, where she's studying psychology. In 2016, she was in her second year, I guess, of psychology, and was away for most of 2016. She was studying in Delhi, and around October 2016, she came to see me. And she basically said that she was feeling a lot of distress and anxiety about everything that was going on in Kashmir. And she couldn't study, it was affecting her grades. As we started talking, what actually came out was something which is perhaps quite common in Kashmiris who live outside of Kashmir, is that she felt a lot of guilt, and she said that she felt guilt because she was safe, and her friends, a lot of her friends had stayed on and were studying in Kashmir. She said, I hear all the time that things are really bad. Her family was in Kashmir, so she was feeling guilty about that. And what that had done was that she felt like she didn't know whether she wanted to go back, because she's like, I feel much safer here, but I also feel like I should be doing something. I should be doing. So I mean, we're still talking. She wants to finish her BA. She wants to go to grad school, and eventually she wants to go back to Kashmir to work as a psychologist. In all of these cases, if we look at what we technically call the prognosis is what is the outcome, what could be the future outcome. Here the prognosis is pretty positive, but there is a difference because in terms of the resources Shazia has, whether it's economical, whether it's social, and mostly because she can leave Kashmir and go back. And that is something that is very relevant here, okay? I did ask a couple of questions for this talk to these people, and so the first question was, how do you feel about your future? And the response was, I'm hopeful and somewhat optimistic. How do you feel about Kashmir's future? Realistically, things won't change unless young people with skills and resources return and do something constructive. I understand the anger and frustration that Kashmiri youth express through protests and stone pelting, but it does not work. Okay? So that is Shazia, and she is one kind of, Kashmiri young person, which is also relevant to look at, Of course, there are the stone pelters and, and we'll talk about that as well. But there's also another side, Kashmir also has people from slightly maybe middle class, upper middle class families who are also going through the same stuff, and they have different problems. Okay. The second is Ahmed. Ahmed is a 24-year-old male. He is a Shia Muslim, which is the minority Muslim community. He is from a peer background, which means that he comes from a generation of peers or healers. He lives in the Shia neighborhood of Prerna Sud, which is near Nagin Lake. And he worked as a counselor at KLL until December 2016. He was the youngest team member we had. He joined when he was 18. He was very intuitive, and he started as a Reiki practitioner, and then he started training as a counselor. He was the only one of the team at that point who didn't have a background in psychology, but he ended up being one of a truly kind of empathetic therapists. Okay. He is also the only son of the family, and there was always a lot of dilemma he faced because his father wanted to join the handicraft business that they had, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to continue. So in 2014, he was very, very active in flood relief. Living by the lake, his family had a shikara. He would go out every day with food and medicine to the little islands, along the lakes, which are actually very hidden. Even on normal days, you don't know they're there. So, most relief work had missed them, but people who lived there knew about them, and he went there with food and medicine and so on. Almost done? Okay. All right. Right after this. So, a lot of it was he went out and he did post-flood intervention. He referred a lot of people from his community to us. He seemed very energized. He's like, I'm going to, he enrolled in the MA program at IGNOU, and he was like, this is what I want to do. 2016 was very, very hard for him because, first of all, he was part of our core team that went to SMHS. On day one, we were just doing intakes. We were talking and getting general information, and Ahmed was sitting with two young men who had pellet injuries. And for a while, he was just sitting there, and I was working across the room, and I saw him, and he just seemed slightly stunned. Then he literally left the room, and apparently he had gone out, and he'd gone to the bathroom, and he'd thrown up. He came back, he said he was sick, so I told him to leave. In the evening, when I spoke to him, I was like, what's going on? He's like, I'm fine, I'm just sick, I'll come back, but tomorrow I won't talk to the patients, I'll just put up the flyers. And again, that kind of rang some warning bells, and I spoke to him that evening, and he essentially was finding it very difficult to maintain therapeutic distance. He was identifying with these boys a lot. They were his age group, they were almost his peers in many ways, and he was experiencing a lot of anger towards them, and he was like, because it's self-destructive, and look at the anguish that they're putting their parents through, and so on. Justine asked him to take a month's leave. 1 month turned into 2. And in December, he essentially said that he couldn't continue. Currently, he is working as a telemarketer in Gurgaon. Okay. So again, I am in touch with him, and I asked him the same questions. How do you feel about your future? He's like, uncertain, don't know what to do next, guilty about abandoning my family and also KLL. What about Kashmir's future? Nothing will change. It will only get worse. Okay? All right. Time for one more case? Or? Okay. Okay, I'll just do the cases and we'll stop. Okay, so case 3 is Qasim. Qasim is a 19-year-old male. We first came across him in the OPD of SMHS. He was referred by the doctor there. He had been injured during protesting, and he had partially lost sight in his left eye. And basically the doctors had asked us to come in because he was being very disruptive in the wards, and he was yelling and he was picking fights with people. And we were asked to come and maybe talk to him. So when we did speak to him, there was a lot of anger, but there was also this kind of reckless kind of behavior and suicidality, which is interesting because he kept saying that, just let me go, and I'm going to go out there, I'm going to pick a fight with either the police or the army so they can shoot me. And the reason for that being that he was like, at least then I'll be a martyr. This way I've lost an eye, I'll possibly be useless for the rest of my life, and I'm still alive, so, I'm neither here nor there. this is also something that we came across quite frequently. Sometimes even from the parents, where they would be like, "Karna tha to pura karte," you know. So things like that. His parents were not like that. His parents were farmers from Shopian in South Kashmir. And basically, we spoke with him. We had 2 sessions with him. We were able to talk him down when it came to the reckless behavior and so on. But then he was gone. In December 2016, his father got in touch with us, and he said that Qasim had come back to the village and was basically sitting in his room all day, and he was taking a lot of sleeping pills, up to 12 Alprax, along with the sleeping pills, and was essentially not doing very much. So we convinced him to come to the Shopian Center, and he started coming. Initially, he was quite eager to talk about what was going on. He came once a week, but now he comes in about once a month. Some of his symptoms have definitely abated. We managed to wean him off the self-medicating stuff. And there is a little bit of hope, because he also goes, I think he's gone to AIMS in Delhi twice to get reconstructive surgery on his eyes. So, but again, he still doesn't know what's going to happen. So I asked him the same 2 questions. How do you feel about your future? If my eyesight returns, I want to train properly as a carpenter. Otherwise, I'm stuck here. Who will marry me with this face and one eye? What about Kashmir's future? I don't care. I have made my sacrifice. It was useless. Okay. All right. Okay, we'll stop there. Yeah? Okay. All right. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
In the starting of your talk, you mentioned that you mainly work with Anganwadi women's. Is Anganwadi women's?
That's one of the outreach programs that we do.
Okay.
Most of our clients are usually people aged between the age of 18 to 30, and they're mostly from Srinagar. So the outreach work is done once a month, where we do awareness camps with Anganwadi women, and they will often take a lot of stuff they've learned in the workshops into the communities, and help maybe identify other people who are undergoing some distress.
Okay. So is there any reason behind taking the Anganwadi women's, or?
Well, also it's a really good network to reach rural Kashmir. They are also, first of all, they are very, very involved in community work, and they have access to people in the community, and people trust them, which is a really big thing. KLL is based in Kashmir, and all our team members are Kashmiri, but I think there's a lack of trust generally. These are people there, and it's like they're not going to tell us to do something that is not good for us. That's kind of the main reason.
Thank you.
Ma'am, in the first part you mentioned that you mainly work with men, like most of the cases are men coming who have increased sexual desires.
No,
And
both men and women. It's more men than women, but we're going to say maybe 60-40. So women who come in, like I said, there's a, either they'll come in because they're in college and they have a boyfriend and these are things that they want to talk about. But often we have seen that they come in around the time that they're thinking of marriage or their marriage has been arranged. Kashmir is unusual in that way that there is, women get married much later. Usually the age of marriage is post 25. It's not unusual to find women studying and working until they're in their late 20s. But the marriages are usually arranged, and a lot of times, it's almost like they have been an adult, whether it's physically, sexually, and so on, for a while, but they are expected still to be virgins when they're married, have no idea about sex and so on. So they're usually coming with this anxiety that, what do I do? If they have symptoms of OCD, a lot of it has to do with that. And usually we find that they've either had a previous sexual relationship for which they feel guilty now, and that has led to, the OCD pattern and a lot of self-harm, cutting behavior that happens. Or, these are things that have never been talked about for them, and so they don't know what's going on.
So ma'am, my question is that when you say about the 60-40 thing, so like, is it because of the fear of disclosure? Like, is there a social taboo related to it?
For both, yeah. There's a great, no one will ever come in to us and say, this is my problem. First, there will be hazar problems about many other things, and only around the third or fourth session, they'll be like, acha, ye bhi hota hai. And so, even though we talk about confidentiality off the bat, and we remind them of it all the time, every session, in fact, we remind them that whatever you talk about is going to be confidential unless you talk about hurting yourself or hurting someone else, and we have to tell other people. But even then, they will not talk about it right away. Even in a closed session, if they have tried talking to friends or family, usually the response is very negative, which is that, this means you're not a good Muslim, or this means you're weak, aapka character weak hai, there's something wrong with you, and all of that. And so this is the first time they're possibly articulating all of it. So it takes a while. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, sorry.
In the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that being in the same community enhances empathy, and then you gave us the case study of Ahmed, where he was from the same community, except he was not able to maintain a therapeutic distance.
Right.
So my question is, how far do you think it is feasible, for the lack of a better word, to employ or say bring in local people to deal with issues like these?
Yeah. I mean, that's a very good question. We are kind of grappling with it a little bit because, like I said, everyone's response, including the team's response post the floods, was just like, this is great, everyone's feeling empowered and energized and all of that. I think somewhere what's happening, especially with Ahmed, is that, first of all, there's lots of personal stuff that's going on with him. There's a direct relation in the anger he feels towards these kids for, jeopardizing the family structure by harming themselves, but which relates to his own issues with his family as well. His dilemma of, not working in the family business and so on. But what's also relevant here is that when we look at empathy, there are two kinds of empathy. There's what we call cognitive empathy, and there's emotional empathy. And when you are training to be a therapist, for example, you need less of the emotional empathy. You need more of that, because it's almost like you don't want to put yourself in their shoes, because that's the traditional definition of empathy, put yourself in someone else's shoes. Here it's almost like experience their experience without pretending to be them, So that is something that we are working on. The benefit of having people from the community outweighs a situation like this. Everyone else is from the same scenario. It was only Ahmed who kind of was struggling. So, like I said, we'll take that. We'll take that, and I have encouraged him to come and maybe see me in Delhi. He doesn't want to, but that's on him. So it's a weighing of options, and it's the fact that these people speak the language, live in that area, are feeling the same things, going through the same things. It's actually very beneficial, even to them. Most of the conversations happen in Kashmiri, and so all of that is very, very useful in that way. Yeah? Okay, great.
I think my question is in continuation with what she also asked. You talked about group model of therapy or community model of therapy. When in sensitive areas like that, it's pretty sure everybody's, even though they're all experiencing the same thing, but the way they experience it and the way they interpret it are going to be two different things, right? So if a group of 5 people are sitting together, one of them, say for example, feels that protesting and pellets and all of that is all right and that is the way to go about it, but there'll be others who'll say against it. So does that have an impact amongst the community, and
Sure.
a new narrative
That's a very good
emerges out of it?
question. Usually group work, when it's done, there are some guidelines in place. It's interesting that actually many people who come to us don't want to talk about politics. I think they live that life so much that, I think people outside of that arena are more engaged in that. The groups that we formed, so for example, one of the groups that we formed was a grief group where people had either lost someone. This was usually 2 or 3 parents, and there were 2 people who had lost brothers. So it was about grief, whether it was about expressing grief, whether about listening to grief. So the structure of the group is such that this is not a platform for you to talk about things that are outside of that ambit, because otherwise groups don't work in general. Groups only work when there's a purpose to them, and there's even the role of the moderator is essentially to make sure that it stays a little bit on course. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Pragya and then Apu.
You told about 3 case studies, and in every case studies you have talking about 3 questions, some questions. What about your future and what about Kashmir's future, right? So my question is about second question. What about Kashmir's future? It can make them more distressed, and what is the relevancy of this question with the distressed people or who are not very well feeling right now that time?
So what you're saying is that if I ask about their future, they're going to feel worse about themselves. Is that your question? So why ask? I don't really understand the question in that way, because my intention is not to have them feel more distressed. This goes a little bit into the second part of, perhaps a talk for some other time, which is about the long-term work that I do with people, and that is a lot about, I practice what's called existential psychotherapy, which is essentially a slightly philosophical idea of looking at grief and looking at trauma. And it is about, it's a very relevant question, because for many people, especially in Kashmir, the 2 questions are intertwined. What about your future? What about Kashmir's future? They're living in Kashmir. Their future is actually very dependent on Kashmir's future. Whether, so this idea that they're all feeling currently pessimistic, it is realistic, but it also kind of gives me an insight into how they're seeing their future, because, other than Shazia, who possibly can go out and work outside, eventually wants to come back, both the other 2 people are going to be in Kashmir. They're going to live in Kashmir. So they have to, whether it is being more realistic about what their options are, whether it is even understanding that, things may change, things may not change. This is part of their life. This is not just a question about, it's not a political question in that way. It's just that, where do you see your life in reference to your life in Kashmir and based on Kashmir's future? Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Ma'am, you talked about Qasim's case, him saying that he made that sacrifice and then going on to display a certain disaffection towards Kashmir's plight. Where do you think that is stemming from? Is it from like having expressed his stress through violence in the first place?
Right.
So,
It's both of those things. There is, perhaps with him especially, like I said, there were so many protesters that year that were injured, and all of them have kind of gone back in the shadows, There are new people who are coming up. The level of protest has changed. I think, the government's response has changed and so on. But for these people, especially for someone like Qasim, I think the disaffection is also somewhat existential in the idea of meaninglessness. First of all, why do we do this? Because nothing changed. That is a question that a lot of people ask all the time. And in fact, we have also worked with the older generation of protesters. This has been going on since the mid-90s, and now the first few generations are now in their 30s and 40s, and they're completely disaffected. There is a level of cynicism there where they're like, what's going to happen? They're going to be exactly like us. I mean, it's very sad, but these are some of the things that we are hoping to address with some of the long-term work that we start to do with clients.
Yeah, earlier in the talk, earlier in the talk, so you mentioned that, the symptoms that you are seeing are more a sort of maladaptive ways to cope up with the stress that is around you. So you also mentioned that there's an urgency to get okay among the patients, that, living in Kashmir, you cannot be in this way or in this state. So my question, and one more thing, you also mentioned that after the flood crisis, I think there was an influx of 40 people or 50 people. I mean, it's a large number of patients coming in. The parents also are, more aware or feeling more responsible to get their children okay. So is it just that it's a conflict state, it's a state of violence where people have developed a more active realization that, something is emotionally or psychologically not well? Is it just a response to that you somewhere in your mind have realized that this situation would have certain sort of effect?
Yeah.
But at the same time, we also have the normalization of violence, because you're living it in every day.
Yeah.
You are taking care of everything in the same usual mode. So why at the same time you have a normalization of violence and an active realization that it's affecting your mental, emotional well-being?
That's a good question.
Thank you.
It perhaps is useful to think of it as a layering of distress. So it's like there's already a base coat of everyday anxiety and depression. And most people don't realize they have it. One reason why we did the radio program, for example, is that there's a recognition that when you're living through this, you feel this is the way things are, and you don't really think that you need help. So people who come to us when there is, people don't come to, especially in Kashmir, people don't come to us unless they're in distress. And which means that something has happened either in their personal life or their professional life where they feel they need help. Sometimes they're referred by doctors who say that nothing's wrong with you physically, go see someone, and that's when they come to us. Post the floods, what happened was that I think there was already this sense of, this is our everyday life, uncertainty, anxiety, depression. But on top of that, there is crisis. So the level of functioning falls entirely. It's almost like you become immobile and you feel that you have to seek help. very few people come for just, I'm depressed and anxious. No, it's not, that is something that we discover during the intake, that is the symptomatology. But usually they'll come with like, I failed my exam, or I don't want to get married to this person. This I'm talking about in everyday life. They don't recognize the symptoms for themselves because they're living that life. Everyone around them is kind of the same. Most Kashmiris, when we do these talks and we talk about these symptoms, they're like, ye to hota hai. That this is actually how we've been, and I guess this is now generation 3. So for them, not only do they feel like that, their parents have felt like that, and in some cases their grandparents have felt like that. So they feel that living in Kashmir, this is how you are. Winter actually, and this is something that is relevant perhaps, winter plays a really important role because everything kind of shuts down. Even psychologically there is, what we call seasonal affective disorder, which is that there is a much higher rate of depression during winter. Kashmiri winters are very, very harsh. And for both 2014 and 16, they have been incredibly harsh. So not only, so there's like now 3 levels. There's generalized, everyday stuff that's going on. There's a crisis that's happened, and then you're going to go to 3 months of winter where things are very, very difficult. Yeah?
Okay. Hi. So you talked about the 3 cases, right? And all of them, you asked the 2 questions. So the answer of all the 3 people and all the 3 youth in the second question was absolutely different. One of them was hopeful that things might change. One of them had given up. And the third one just doesn't care. So these political views, how do they affect the personal interaction of these people in the society and the community? Because that also becomes an essential part, how they support each other and how they talk amongst each other.
Yeah, like I said, I'm surprised that several of you are looking at this as a political kind of question. That wasn't my intent, and that's partly because, like I said, it's not political because it is actually their future. They live in Kashmir. Kashmir's future is their future. Even Shazia wants to go back. Perhaps she is hopeful because she needs to be hopeful in order to go back. No one wants to go back where there is no hope, right? For the other 2, yes, there is a certain degree of hopelessness there, but it kind of mirrors how they feel about themselves, and that is also relevant. This is who they are, and very often within the same group of people, 5 different people will have different ideas about their own future and Kashmir's future. But if you talk to anyone who has directly been impacted by the violence, they will have a certain kind of answer to that question, which is a mixture of hopelessness and also disaffection, perhaps. So does that answer your question?
Okay. Hi. So you've spoken about religion over here, and I just wanted to understand if you could talk a little bit more about the role of religion or any belief system in such conflict zones, where it plays the nature of one, it's blasphemous at one end, on the other end, it's a bedrock where you don't become suicidal. So in general, if you could talk about the role of religion, and when you do such therapies, do you use it, not use it, and how does it play out?
Good question. So I have been in Kashmir now for 6 years, but people who've been here much longer have talked a lot about the radicalization that's happening in Kashmir. There is, you hear of all the money that is coming from Saudi Arabia, but you also see it in how people dress, you also see it in how people respond. Even the language has changed a little bit. So, and this was pointed out to me by several Kashmiris themselves. So a small example, saying goodbye usually is Khuda Hafiz. Now they've started saying Allah Hafiz. And that is not something that is traditionally said in Kashmiri Urdu. This comes from a slightly more radical version of Urdu itself. Even the word Ramzan. These are things that people kind of talk about. So Ramzan is how Kashmiris used to say it. Now everyone says Ramadan, which is the Saudi way of saying it. So there has been perhaps more radicalization in society. You see it in how people dress. I'm told that even 10 years ago, not so many women wore scarves. You know, now you see not just scarves, you see full burqas. We get a lot of clients who come with full burqas. You see a lot more of the men having a beard, and you know, so that has changed, and that, you know, the latter two I've kind of seen in even the team. You know, we now have team members who are changing how they dress and so on. In terms of you know, religion, it provides a great deal of succor and relief, I must say. You know, I think it has, for most part, even mosques and imams have been very supportive. You know, a lot of the, for example, relief work that was done post floods was set up by the mosques and communities. These were places of shelter and so on. But I think, you know, there is perhaps some radicalization at the mosques as well. So again, I don't know how much of this is to do with the changing you know, situation in Kashmir, where as people start to feel that they have fewer and fewer resources, they reach out to religion as a way to support themselves. But yeah, it is happening. It is becoming more radicalized as a society. And again, a lot of people who are Kashmiris who've been there for generations are sometimes distressed by this, because Sufism is actually a very gentle and kind of all-encompassing version of Islam. So even they find it difficult. You know, like for example, Shazia's parents find it very hard, and there was a lot of issues that happened with her not wearing a headscarf to school, because other kids were calling her out on it, and you know, so there's things like that that are happening. Yeah.
In therapy, is that, how do you like deal
Okay,
that? Just
good.
one part.
Thank you for that reminder. So you know, we get a lot of people who have gone to peers for jinns and all of these things. We don't discourage them from doing that. That is their belief. But we will ask them that if they're going to the peer, then they come to us once they're finished with that process, and if they're seeing us, do not see the peer in that particular way. But it's a long-standing tradition, you know. All of them will have done some version of that spiritual kind of work as well. And you know, I mean, we are no one to say whether it's right or wrong. That's not our role. Yeah?
Two more questions.
Hello. Yeah, so my question is, the youth of Kashmir, so to say, when in relation to outsiders or in relation to each other in Kashmir, what is the identity of self that they give to themselves? Like for many of us, there is a basic identity of where we come from, or some might relate to the nation, say we're Indian, or some might say I'm from Andhra Pradesh. There's that basic level of identification of self. How does that play out in the youth of Kashmir, and how does that affect their entire definition of themselves?
You know, there isn't, they're all Kashmiri, so they're talking to other Kashmiris, so they don't need to kind of define themselves as Kashmiri. There is some identification in terms of being Sunni and Shia. That happens sometimes, especially around Muharram. There is, other than that, you know, everyone there is Kashmiri. They're all, when they perhaps go to other states, you know, when they come to Bangalore, that's perhaps when this idea of being Kashmiri kind of becomes relevant and resonant for them. But by themselves, they're actually, you know, they all have a very similar identity. I'm skirting that question of being Indian because I don't want to be controversial, but I think you can imagine what the answer to that is.
Okay. Ma'am, if you could generalize, if one could generalize how mental health professionals are trained in this country, in the mainland, if you can call it,
Do you see any gaps in enabling them to cater to a peculiar group or a group of people in Kashmir? Or essentially what I'm asking is, a practitioner in Bangalore, would they be somehow disabled by design?
Yeah. Yeah, they would be. You know, it is a unique kind of situation. Perhaps in the Northeast, there's some similarity. But which is why we at KLL encourage people to come and intern with us. So, you know, usually they'll spend a few months and they'll train with us. They'll do maybe basic intakes and basic kind of stuff. Because unless you live that life, you don't know what's going on, you know. Even for me, after all this time, the fact that I can leave, you know, is something that actually I hold on to a lot. But knowing that I can be there, I can, you know, I've started to speak and understand Kashmiri now. If you have to work with that particular population, I think you have to make the effort to be a part of their lives and to be there. Yes?
Thank you.